You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 352 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the trial of a Guantanamo Bay detainee, an alleged mastermind of the USS Cole bombing. I'm going to update Julian Assange's situation, and I want to discuss the civil war in Libya and focus in on the military capabilities of the leader of Eastern Libya, Field Marshal Haftar. I need you guys to help the show to grow. The best way to do that is by sharing the show or recommending it to someone. You find the show online at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Once you listen to a couple shows and like it, make sure you subscribe to it, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. It should be up anywhere people listen to podcasts. I update current events on the show, so the way you get the most out of it is by listening to every episode. While you're there, if you could give me a rating and review, that's helpful. I noticed a couple new ratings and reviews on the iTunes page within the past couple weeks. Not only is it cool for me to read that people actually like the show, but I think it is really helpful in deciding for somebody, if they want to listen to a new show, they go down, they see somebody saying, hey man, this show is awesome. You learn a ton of news, the most important things about the U.S. empire. That's why you got to tune in and listen. And then if you want to donate to the show, you could do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, starting off here with the Space Force. Now, Trump has signed the executive order on the Space Force, and I think there's a lot of momentum in getting something created here. Now, I think there's still a lot left to be decided on how this actually looks once it's all created, but this panel was having a vote on whether the Space Force should be its own separate branch. The alternative would be to make the Space Force a portion of the Air Force like the Marines are for the Navy. I'm guessing there's probably going to be a lot of savings in administrative costs and stuff like that, and that's the way Congress will look at it and try to justify potentially keeping the Space Force as a part of the Air Force. Although there will be others, and especially the more hawkish type, that say Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are doing terrible things, and so we must spend whatever amount necessary to keep the American people safe, and we need to start putting weapons and defense systems in space, and the way that we do that is by creating a defense space force. Now, of course, all this is just big checks and dollar signs to the military-industrial complex, who, by the way, is about to get their man as the Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, longtime Boeing executive. I talked about a lot in the past of the show, but there's a great write-up in the American Conservative by Kelley Vlahos that I'm going to link to in the show notes page for those of you who want to understand his background. I also think there's this consequence that if we end up with a Space Force, then the Air Force is going to be like, well, if they're getting an extra $3 billion, we have to get an extra $3 billion because you said we were our own separate thing, and so we need our own separate money. This kind of thing really happens in government agencies. And, even as Scott Horn talks about with the nuclear planning, well, if the Army's going to get to hit these targets with nuclear weapons, then the Air Force wants to hit these targets, and so then the Navy wants to hit these targets, and essentially, you end up with nuclear overkill just because some bureaucrats don't want to be left out of something that I'm sure they only believe is planning and will never actually play out. But, they have to work for their guys and, get all the jobs they can for their departments and can't have any cuts for their employees. And so then, we end up with these ridiculous plans to bomb cities hundreds of times. Hundreds may be an exaggeration, but more than necessary. And so then you're going to want the Space Force in on this, especially once we do something stupid like start to weaponize space. Now, there is potential here, I think, for us as, humans to decide not to weaponize space any more than already has been. I mean, the Pentagon and all other countries have imaging satellites up in space and stuff like that. But at this time, there's no skirmishes going on in space. There's no standoff between American and Iranian satellites, and we're threatening to fire. And so, most of what goes on in space is giving us, really awesome technology and communications capabilities. That's why, the past couple of years, I rarely go anywhere where I don't have the highest, best internet connection on my iPhone. and I could like Google whatever I want, whatever the hell I want. It's awesome. But if the more we weaponize space, I think the more we get away from the, better capabilities of us as humankind of putting just market and capitalism and, stuff like that in space rather than weapons. Something people have been pointing out with the recent crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX planes is that Boeing had a much better record before they became more of a government contracting company. And that's because of the way kind of politics, bureaucracy, and business play out when you inject a high amount of government corruption into it. And so they're saying that, maybe some of these 737 MAXs that went down wouldn't have if Boeing was operating as a, better company than they currently are. And then there's also the issue of once you become this like military industrial complex level company, well, how much can somebody actually sue Boeing? If they're the ones that are making the F-15Xs, the new fighter planes that are going into the U.S. fleet, the government isn't going to let Boeing be sued out of existence. And hell, if Boeing makes a stink about it, maybe they could get them out of any lawsuits at all. So there's a lot of downside to a more expansive Space Force. And I don't know, the ruling of this House panel seems good to me, although I'm sure that we're going to continue to move ahead with, weaponizing space, especially under the Trump administration here. An armed F-16 crashed into a California warehouse. It's a good reminder that even though they're flying these training missions, I think quite frequently in the U.S. and most of the time nothing happens. I mean, there is risk to carrying on a whole bunch of unnecessary flights and highly technological, military equipment and pushing them to the edge of their capabilities and, training the fighter pilots to be the absolute best they can in case they ever have to dogfight with the Russian pilots. Well, sometimes this ends up with a, F-16 in a warehouse and, eventually this can end up killing civilians. And so I wonder how much oversight goes on of this kind of thing. You never hear about anybody, really talking about looking to hold people accountable when there are these training accidents. Some recent polling, I'm going to link to the article here in the show notes page for those of you who want more details, but some recent polling shows that Americans favor arms control agreements. And so when they polled on the NPT treaty, the New START treaty, the INF treaty, Americans say, yeah, we want nuclear arms control. Also shows that Americans don't know how many nukes we actually have and what they're doing. So that's kind of disturbing since, these are the weapons of genocide. But positive note is that when you actually ask Americans, they favor arms control. Now, the problem is we're going to have an election here where everybody's going to be talking about Russia, but nobody's going to be talking about arms control. In fact, it's going to be completely ignoring the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons and saying that Russia committed a 9/11 against the United States by whatever hacking the election means. And in reality, if there's a concern to be had with Russia, is that both countries still have a nuclear arsenal, and all the Democrats should be talking about is how they're going to extend the New START treaty, how they're going to undo one of Trump's biggest mistakes and restore the INF treaty. And, if somebody wants to be really pushing the policy, maybe like a Tulsi Gabbard, she could say, we made a mistake with John Bolton the first time under Bush, and we should go back in the ABM treaty and encourage all kinds of nuclear disarmament between the two countries. That could really happen. I think, at this point, Russia seems to be somewhat of a willing participant here, especially if we could elect somebody in the United States and come to agreements that I think reduce the stockpiles quicker. That way Russia doesn't have to worry about the next administration coming in and backing out of the treaty before, maybe 1,000 nukes are actually gone. All right. I want to break down this coal bombing trial here. So we have the alleged mastermind of the coal bombing in the Guantanamo Bay prison, and I believe he's been there since 2002 or 2003. The coal bombing, of course, is a terror attack before 9/11, actually. I believe in Yemen's port of Aden, but it may have been Hodeidah. And basically a small boat, and I don't know if it's like the size of a speedboat or a little bit bigger, drives up next to the coal and detonates a huge amount of explosives, killing, I think, close to 20 U.S. personnel on that ship, different sailors. So it's a horrible tragedy. But at the same time, of course, what was the coal doing in the Middle East? It's not like Clinton had just spent years bombing Iraq or anything like that. It seems a little bit less like this was just a peace mission, the coal, but, this was certainly an asymmetrical guerrilla warfare terrorist style attack. And so we now have the mastermind in jail, and we've been trying to prosecute him, and I believe looking at the death penalty. Now, what happened here is that we had a judge that made several rulings, all very favorable to the U.S. government. And the defense team all along was saying, well, these rulings don't seem correct. And also the judge is applying for a job on an immigration court, which is, I guess, kind of a cushy job for a judge. And so, maybe there's a conflict of interest here because he's adjudicating a trial where has a job application into the prosecution to go work for them in a really good job. So I think a civilian judge ends up overruling the decisions of the military judge in this tribunal, the guy trying to get a job with, I believe, the Justice Department. And so here's another trial that's basically back to square one. The guy served close to 20 years now without a trial. And, I think this is one of the problems of trying to wage a global empire here, is that if you commit war crimes in different countries, you're going to have asymmetrical warfare waged against you. And then you're going to want to look to get justice for the American victims of that asymmetrical warfare. But what kind of justice can you give, a war criminal who's going to tell some kid that, hey, what you need to do for your religion and to be, the best person you could be is to hop in this boat right here and go blow up those guys over there. And so then you end up doing things like creating a Guantanamo Bay torture prison and trampling all over the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth and the Sixth, you know what I mean here, and trying to figure out what you're going to do about Americans who tortured people, something that we absolutely find unacceptable. And, something I think most Americans would say that, the best part about America is we don't do stuff like that here. So as I said, with the judges ruling, the trial starting over, it's unlikely, I think, that this guy ever gets convicted of anything. In part, they said this is because the guy who was the key witness in the trial is now in Saudi Arabia. In exchange for being a key witness in the trial, he got moved, I believe, to a Saudi prison where I think he's going to be living a much cushier life than he would have been in Guantanamo Bay. And so then again, you have issues, potential moral problems with offering plea deals, coaxing people into lying. I don't really have any reason to doubt this guy isn't the mastermind of the Cole bombing. And so, it's possible he does deserve life in prison. But at the same time, if we're going to have a justice system and our justice system has precedents and, we think it's really important not to torture innocent people, then you really harm your whole justice system by having this world empire and trying to prosecute these cases against people who are waging asymmetrical warfare against you. All right, so apparently the United States is getting possession of the assets that Julian Assange left in the Ecuadorian embassy. There's going to be a lot of protesting about this. I don't think there's anything the U.S. could really particularly do to stop it or to have it stopped, anything the protesters could do. I think the U.S. is pretty much going to get their way here. Let's hope that Assange didn't leave anything important in that embassy. I would have to imagine that, especially with the rhetoric leading up to this. I mean, I had talked about on the show several times, well, it was certainly something I didn't want to happen. I really was hoping it would and didn't think that it would. It ends up happening. But there was some foreshadowing here. So maybe if he had anything important that, the U.S. could either potentially use against him or use against leakers, he was able to destroy that or hide that. On Venezuela, we had Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition, the guy trying to carry out a coup against Maduro, recognized by the U.S. government and I think like 50 of our other allies, had his envoy to the U.S. meet with the Pentagon and the State Department. Now, in one sense, this is disturbing because it seems like one of the things that would convince Donald Trump to take military action in Venezuela is having, the Venezuelan government, as I guess he claims to recognize it, asking him to do that. He said, well, the Venezuelans want us to go, so, now we're going to do this. This, with Chalabi in the Iraq war is something that was very convincing for the American people. So this is, scary in that sense. Hopefully the Pentagon told him to get the hell out of town and we're not going to fight a war for Juan Guaido, somebody that doesn't have all that much support in Venezuela. Every time he tries to wage a coup, nobody comes out to support him anyways. I see some hope that the Pentagon would possibly turn Guaido away and say, our troops aren't going to die for you. Where the State Department, I think they're more likely to help, and it seems that they are helping. Of course, it's led by Pompeo right now, who seems to be a hawk on Venezuela. But we have Guaido's guys meeting with the State Department, and we've had the State Department recently say what they're working on is trying to isolate Venezuela, from Cuba, and Russia. In Tajikistan, we had a prison riot that killed 32 people. The government claims that's 29 inmates and 3 guards. The government says that this was started by the Islamic State. The 20-year-old son of a former Tajikistan Special Operations commander defects to the Islamic State, killed in Syria. His son's arrested in Tajikistan, and they believe he started this riot. It's unknown if he either escaped or is among the dead. However, there are some human rights groups who are saying that there's political prisoners in the facility where the riot occurred. And so this could be something far different than a prison riot where, maybe there's just enough abuse going on that the prisoners attempted to fight back. Or if the prison riot started, it could have nothing to do with the Islamic State or jihad, just internal Tajik politics. In Afghanistan, a U.S. airstrike killed 8 Afghan police. This seems to be a friendly fire incident. I had to read a couple times just to make sure that this wasn't a case of the U.S. carrying out the airstrike because somebody on the Afghan side flipped sides and start firing at them. It seems that this was just a mistake. In Syria, we have Russia alleges al-Nusra, or the al-Qaeda-linked Syrian rebels, of carrying out a drone attack on their main air base in Syria. They say they repelled this. Now, I'm always skeptical now of when I hear drone attack, just because I think that could mean something of like $100 toy you could buy in the United States, potentially even strapping those things with some C4 or something like that, up to, something that's actually military grade, is capable of firing a missile. Wrapping up today's show with news on Africa. First up here is Libya, and I want to talk about Haftar's military capabilities. There's a great article in Mideast Eye that really takes step by step what happened, who added to Haftar's military, or I've also heard his name pronounced Haftar. It's either Khalif Haftar or Haftar. I believe he calls himself Field Marshal. Other people label him General, but essentially he's the military leader of the Eastern Libyan government. And I think he's more or less the head of the government, although there is a Congress in that area as well. Overall, his military, I think, is about 2,500 troops with several other kind of auxiliary forces. I think some, about 2,000 that are pretty successful, are led by one of his brothers or family members. There's some different militants that number, I think, about 6,000 that have joined his cause. And now also there's some different militias from the southern region that have joined his forces. He also has about 15 functioning aircraft. I think most are Russian made but have come from other sources. Many were bought by different Middle Eastern or African countries on behalf of General Haftar. This includes Egypt, the UAE, and Sudan. One interesting note on Sudan is believed they transferred Iranian drones to Haftar because he has some Iranian-made drones in his arsenal as well. This was far more extensive. If you had asked me a month ago what his military capabilities are, I would have thought it was pretty much only ground forces with maybe some rudimentary drones that they're throwing together that have some, capabilities, and, it's not like it's duct taped, but at the same time, these are drones that are loaded with explosives and just directed at a target. There's also the fact that you've had air support from the UAE at the very least on behalf of Haftar. He also has something of a navy too. He's been given several ships by French companies actually, and also received a repurposed Irish ship at an auction. Where the auction is, where you buy yourself a naval vessel, I really want to know, but apparently that's something that exists in the world, and Haftar got himself one that way. And so, to me, understanding that this is his force, especially when you look at the opposition just numbering a few thousand militants and then whatever backing the U.S. and UN are willing to provide, that Haftar controls so much of Libya. Now, Haftar did try to take the capital city, and it seems his advance was repelled. Mainly this is because some militants from a different city in the UN-US controlled government's territory, Marista, came to defend the capital city from Haftar's forces. However, there's this thing in Libya called the Great Man-Made River. And this was, I think, the grand achievement of Muammar Gaddafi, really, where he took all these aquifers and did all this infrastructure projects It made it possible to direct an awful lot of fresh, clean water from southern Libya up to the more populated areas near the Mediterranean. A huge accomplishment. Now, one of the real fears of the Libyan war was that this would be destroyed. I think the U.S. actually maybe targeted some facilities or was looking at targeting some facilities in their NATO-led war there. But now we have some militants who have taken control of one of these facilities and have apparently cut off water to Tripoli, and residents are starting to notice. The U.S. UN-backed government blames Haftar. Haftar says it wasn't him, it was some other group of militants. Not exactly sure how to figure this out, but it would seem that Haftar would have the motivation to do this, as his first effort to take the capital city failed. Other areas of Africa, in Egypt, we had a militant bombing of a tourist bus near the Gaza pyramids. They loaded a bunch of shrapnel and put around some explosive, blew it up. I think they had 12 people injured in that attack. As far as I know, no one died. The next couple of days, Egyptian security forces carried out a raid and killed 12 militants. It's unknown if these militants were responsible for that attack or the raid is coincidental to the bus bombing. In Algeria, protests continue demanding elections. Bad news is we possibly have a delay in those elections that are supposed to occur, I think, near the beginning of July. And last up here, Nigeria, the Islamic State there killed 28 soldiers in an attack. This is a larger number than are usually killed in these ISIS attacks. Usually it's an outpost. 6, 8, 12 soldiers dead. So it means that there must have been some sizable or technologically capable ISIS force that carried out this attack, and just more evidence of the instability in the Lake Chad Basin Sahel region of Africa. All right, guys, that's where I'm wrapping up for today. I'm hope to have a good show with you on Friday with Will Porter talking about Iran and some other stuff. So make sure you tune in for that. Share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Find me on social media at KYAAALE on Twitter. Donate to the show, Patreon/Foreign Policy Focus.